Hello out there in YouTube land. Mark Allen Gunnels here. It's been a while since I've done one of these YouTube videos, but I have something new to promote, so here I am. Actually, I have something old to promote in a new form. Apex Publishing has put out a new edition of my zombie novella Asylum, which originally came out in 2010. It comes complete with a brand new gorgeous cover. And also it contains not only the novella, but a new original short story called Lunatics Running the Asylum, which acts as a sequel to the novella and actually takes place very shortly after the conclusion of Asylum. I'm very excited to have this one back on the market in this new form. It's a favorite of mine. I think it's really representative of what I do as a writer. So I'm pretty excited, and I'm starting a promotion extravaganza to try to get the word out. And so today I'm going to be doing a brief reading from both the novella Asylum and the short story Lunatics Running the Asylum, just to give you some idea of what it is. The novella, the new edition, is available both digitally and in a paperback edition. So I hope you like what I'm about to read. There is some adult content here, so just a warning. I don't think I have any underage viewers, but just FYI. So here we go with the reading from Asylum. When the dead arose, Jimmy was going down on the balding accountant. Curtis was standing several yards away from the accountant's car, by the corner of the club, the neon sign above him shedding a harsh blue light over his body. Asylum was the name of the place, but the S and U were burned out, and no one had bothered to replace them, so the sign currently read ASYLUM. Curtis shivered, pulled his light jacket tighter around himself, and checked his watch. 4:30 in the morning. He wanted to go back to the dorms, but Jimmy was his ride. Curtis also had to urinate something awful, but there was no way he was going to the restroom in the club. He'd made the mistake of trying that earlier in the night and walked in on some kind of orgy. So much that had happened tonight had been a shock for Curtis. This was his first trip to a gay club, and seeing so many homosexuals gathered in one place was a revelation. Growing up in a small southern town, Curtis had always felt alienated, alone, a freak among the multitudes. But at Asylum, the freaks were the multitude. Men dancing together and kissing right out in the open, no fear or shame evident. Curtis had initially resisted when Jimmy had offered to take him to the club, but Curtis was glad he finally agreed. Of course, there was enough small town in Curtis for him to be appalled by the easy sexuality on display at Asylum. The bathroom orgy, Jimmy's random hookup with the accountant, the stripper with the dreadlocks and the sculpted chest. These things had the power to make Curtis uncomfortable. Still a virgin at age 20, Curtis had yet to even kiss a man. He certainly couldn't imagine hopping into some stranger's car and giving him a blowjob. Curtis sometimes wondered why he and Jimmy were friends. They were so different. Where Curtis was shy and awkward in social situations, Jimmy was a blaze of self-confidence and gregarious charm. On the surface, they had nothing in common other than being gay. But in some ways, Curtis thought it was their differences that drew them to one another. Curtis admired Jimmy's openness about his sexuality, his refusal to be anyone other than who he was. Conversely, Curtis suspected that Jimmy saw him as a project, a naive, inexperienced little gay boy that he could mold and teach in the ways of gaydom. And lesson number 1 had been fashion. Curtis had always dressed conservatively, favoring khaki slacks and button-up shirts, but Jimmy, whose own fashion sense included things like bright orange felt pants and women's blouses, had been trying to change that. Curtis resisted the wildest articles Jimmy tried to push on him, but he had started moving toward a more casual look. Lesson number 2 had been hair. Not one for product, Curtis had never used gel or mousse in his hair, but Jimmy had taught him to style it in a spiky way that Curtis actually thought was rather flattering. Jimmy had tried to talk Curtis into bleaching his brown locks, but all Curtis would agree to were a few blonde highlights. Lesson number 3 had been Asylum. Feeling uncharacteristically daring, Curtis had allowed Jimmy to dress him in a pair of tight leather pants that were uncomfortable in the crotch region, and a hot pink t-shirt with the logo "I Love Boys" emblazoned across the chest. Jimmy had balked when Curtis had insisted on wearing a jacket over the shirt, arguing that it ruined the effect, but the late autumn night was chilly. Jimmy himself had worn a pair of red vinyl pants that looked painted on, and an actual fur coat, rabbit fur, he said, under which he wore no shirt, his bare chest and pierced nipples on display. The odd thing about Jimmy, and one of the things Curtis admired about him, was that he seemed perfectly at home in such an outrageous outfit. In contrast, Curtis, his own outfit much tamer by comparison, felt like he was wearing a Halloween costume. Curtis had spent most of the night by the bar, nursing a succession of watery sodas, while Jimmy had danced with a succession of attractive men. If such displays could be called dancing, to Curtis's eyes it had looked more like dry humping to music. A couple of times Curtis had lost track of Jimmy, and he suspected that the accountant wasn't his friend's first hookup of the night. A few men had approached Curtis, and he had made an honest effort to flirt, but he wasn't very practiced in the art of courtship, and it came out as spastic and clumsy. When one man had asked him to dance, Curtis had answered, "I have 2 right feet," and only after the man gave him a puzzled look and wandered away did Curtis realize he meant to say he had 2 left feet. And now Curtis was shivering in the cold, his bladder becoming more and more insistent, while waiting for Jimmy to finish sucking off some guy whose name he probably didn't even know. Curtis scanned the parking lot. The night was winding down, and the lot was empty except for 8 cars. The windows of the accountant's Mustang were steamed over, but Curtis could just make out the ghostly shape of the accountant and Jimmy's bobbing head. Other than the 3 of them, the parking lot was deserted. Curtis turned and headed for the corner of the building. With one final peek over his shoulder, he darted around the corner and unzipped, freeing his dick from the sweaty confines of the leather pants and relieving himself against the side of the club. He threw his head back and sighed, his breath puffing out like smoke. He was tucking himself back in when the screaming began. And that is the opening section of Asylum. Just gives you a little taste. It is an opening I've always liked and always been proud of. I think the first line gets your attention. And I'm also going to skip to the very end at the new short story, Lunatics Running the Asylum, and I'm going to read you just a little bit of that as well. It doesn't give any real spoilers for how the novella ends, so I think we're safe on doing this. When the building emerged from the fog, Brock thought the structure looked like it was on fire, the mist churning like smoke. Of course, in the week since the dead had risen and the world turned into a shitstorm of epic proportions, Brock had seen a lot of fires. Started most of them. The easiest way to clear a building full of stiffs. Originally the guard were calling the creatures the Risen, but that sounded a little too Jesus-y, so they'd started calling them stiffs instead. Was to seal it up with the walking corpses inside and set the whole thing ablaze. Brock had never been a pyro in his former life, but he found he had a real love for it now. Everything about the experience, the intense heat, the flickering light, the acrid smoke, the crackling of wood and tinkling of shattering glass, had a sensual effect on him. As he stood in the gravel parking lot staring up at the building, he felt that itch, his thumb aching to flick the flint. But that wasn't why he and Stedman were here. They had broken from their unit as they scoured the city to play a game Stedman had come up with. He called Sticking It to the Stiffs. "This looks like as good a place as any," Stedman said, looking much older than his 17 years in his riot gear and the assault rifle in his hands. "Should be plenty to choose from in there, and we're isolated enough we shouldn't be interrupted." "Yes, sir." Yes, sir. Those 2 words summed up the relationship between the 2 guardsmen perfectly. Brock was only a year younger than Stedman, but he both feared the older boy and admired him, wanted to emulate him. Stedman evinced a natural confidence and strength that Brock could only imitate. Of course, it never occurred to him that his fellow guardsmen might be faking it as well. "Come on," Stedman growled and started forward, Brock following along behind. A few stiffs wandered around in the parking lot, coming out of the fog like ghosts. Stedman took care of them with a bullet each to the head. Brock and Stedman weren't real soldiers, but the guard wasn't really an army. The guard formed from what was left of the Charlotte Police Department, but that hadn't amounted to much, so they'd recruited any able-bodied persons they could find, regardless of age. They'd heard the real National Guard was mobilizing and starting relief and rescue efforts, but Sheriff Peterman said they couldn't wait. So the Charlotte Guard did what they could to rid the city of stiffs in the meantime, and occasionally, like now, blowing off some steam. As they drew closer to the building, Brock saw a sign that said "Asylum," and for some reason this made him laugh, the sound loud and harsh inside his helmet. A glass door led into a short hallway, and a cluster of stiffs had bottleneck at the end, beating and clawing at the door. And that's just the very beginning of the short story Lunatics Running the Asylum, which is a part of the new edition of my zombie novella Asylum. So I hope you like the reading. I hope maybe it piqued your interest. You can find it on Amazon, like I said, paperback or digitally. Give it a look. If you read it and like it, or if you read it and hate it, leave a brief review. I am a writer who craves feedback. And thank you very much for listening.